across the book. Now the book is, having had the opportunity to have a bit of a sneak preview of it, gives a really interesting itinerary of the development of painting away from mimesis through a number of stages off the canvas onto the floor and then into the space of discourse that Mark tracks and then subjects to, I think, a really interesting and quite innovative analysis that's based on the ontology, or more particularly the differentiation of between ontology and the ontic in the work of Martin Heidegger. And from there he constructs an ontology of painting, I guess a study of the being of painting, an ontology of colour, to arrive at a methodology of what Mark describes as post-aesthetics, and then quite provocatively towards the end of the book at this idea of, forgive me if I pronounce it incorrectly, qualitetics.
I'm not sure how to say it either.
Quite a handy neologism
Yeah.
that embraces a number of ideas. The continual question that keeps being asked in the book is one that departs from Mark's thesis that a number of the practices that go by other names within art theory and within art criticism are already expanded forms of painting. It follows that he asks the question, what is painting? What is expanded painting? What are some of the problems that are fundamental to painting that can be used to discuss art within a broader framework? There are a number of threads I think that we can tease out. I had thought of quite a few questions regarding the book, but first I wanted to discuss your stance on the artist as writer, or artists who write, because it is so central to your practice.
Yes. It's something I've written about as well. For Art Monthly, I wrote a two-piece article on the idea. And I guess the first argument I made there was something like, we're relatively used to artists who are also musicians, or artists who do several other disciplines with art, but an artist who writes seems like a kind of a horse that talks. It doesn't seem quite right. Yet, there's an enormous history of artists who have written, from Leonardo to Van Gogh to Malevich and Mondrian, and all of the conceptual artists of the 60s. So it's a big tradition. It's kind of lost from view in some way. And I was heavily influenced by Ian Byrne, the Australian conceptual artist, and he, for me, is one of the great artists who write. And it's not like you have to write to be an artist, but eventually every artist does write in one form or another, from a grant proposal to an angry letter to a critic, to eventually being drawn into writing articles and books as well. So it just happens all the time in different ways. But I'm particularly drawn to people who have a double practice, which is publishing on their field of practice, not necessarily writing about themselves, and publishing as much as they have exhibitions. And when you kind of put that frame on it, it cuts it down to a really interesting thread that goes from Leonardo through Van Gogh and Byrne to lots of people doing that today.
And you emerged at a moment, though, I guess, in the 1980s, when there were a lot of artists writing, there were a lot of artists actively being published. Without wanting to seem nostalgic for something that I was too young to have personally lived through, I did do, at a certain point, was actually kind of quite fascinated by the sheer degree of production of artists who were, let's say, picking up on the do-it-yourself ethos of punk at that time, and not waiting around for institutions or art critics or collectors or curators to actually shape the discourse around their work for them, and we're actually kind of getting out there and saying things. Was it easier to write and publish at that time, do you think, Mark? Was it more encouraged, or was it just part of the zeitgeist?
It was obligatory to write then. because of the whole postmodern spirit around the close relationship between practice and theory. And in fact, one of the criticisms in the last days of postmodernism was that the work was an illustration of the theory. So that was kind of a mean-spirited attitude to what we're doing in terms of becoming as interested in the contemporary thinkers of the day, Baudrillard being one of the major ones, and thinking about how you would articulate your work through the best thinkers of the day. And that was in many ways a reaction to the idea that your art just spoke for itself. You didn't have to say a word, and the art spoke for itself. Yeah.
I guess at the current moment there are artists who write, but not who publish, I guess, in the in journals or magazines. And I think one of the major venues now for debate around contemporary art in the written word is, of course, social media. But I think that comes with its own dynamics, and one of those is a certain mode of argumentation that, first of all, needs to be quite brief, but also quite combative.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit different, maybe, to some of the kind of longer form writing that you've pursued throughout your practice.
Well, it was pretty common in the 80s to write, 100-word, 200-word catalogue essay to go with the show. So that approaches that in some way. But,
right.
I think the whole social media, internet is flavoured by anger. And it's so easy in that situation to let your demon out and also misunderstand what someone else is saying and take it as aggressive. And all I see is flames in social media debates, so I should really shy away from it.
I was thinking earlier, watching Cass's performance, of a certain phrasing that she used, which, of course, in my reading of the book I didn't notice, but the freedom of painting was a phrase that was isolated there.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, without wanting to become sort of too Adornian and purist about the space that painting can offer, that perhaps there is some sort of contrast there that would inform your writing, that enables you to maybe move past stages of anger.
Yes.
So let's move to painting. You've written a book about it, but how would you very briefly describe this idea of expanded painting?
I think the best metaphor is the mobile phone. In many ways, there's always an argument that suggests that art follows the spirit of the day. But some people would argue that actually art leads the day and the spirit catches up with it eventually. But I think there's a unique relationship between the mobile phone and virtually every art discipline and every discipline, every way of living in the world at the moment, which is the process of expansion and convergence. So this thing that we happen to call a phone really does everything for us, from being a diary, a voice recorder, a video, a camera, connection to the internet. And that in its own way mirrors the fact that, we have to do our own typing. We have to be multitasking all the time. That is the nature and the spirit of the times we live in. There's a kind of a convergence into one place. Everything converges on the phone. So it does in the arts and in painting. And convergence and expansion are really the same thing. So as painting expands out to virtually colonise all the other disciplines are converging on painting as well.
It's interesting you mention the phone, because you do touch on the question of technology in relation to painting's evolutions.
Yeah.
And as a response, I guess, to a certain oft expressed sentiment that that painters today or that artists today are moving away from traditional craft. And you make the point that a lot of the evolutions in terms of what was possible in painting were made possible by technology, and of course the key one is not having to grind and mix your own pigment, so that artists have industrially produced tubes of paint that they can take out into plein air. They start suddenly understand light and painting at speed. I guess the other influence of technology on painting, on art in general, being not exclusively but generally a very visual medium, is the evolution of different regimes of vision according to technology. And so I think the other great figure here, and it's one that you touch on, is that of cinema and of television. That shift let's call it a general aesthetic or a kind of a form of perception and demand new forms of formal engagement, at least from artists.
Yeah, look, the whole thing around the technology of colour is really interesting for me, and something that I can play out infinitely. So that change from how colour arrived on an artist's palette, from tubes with pig, from grinding your own colours that might have been from a rare beetle or a rare mineral from a distant place, to things that were manufactured. So the point of transition of interest for me is when colour leaves tubes and tins altogether, and suddenly there are things all around us that are filled with colour. So why can't fluorescent builder's string or resin in a plastic picnic set also be the carrier of colour for a painter? So it means at a certain point technology enables the painter to leave all those traditional carriers of colour behind and find other carriers of colour. And even the TV screen becomes a carrier of colour. And when I grew up in the golden age of television, I was absolutely fascinated by the inner glow of colour that came from the TV screen. And it then became a challenge to painting. Could painting actually light a fire in my eyes the way a TV or a cinema screen would do? And of course, for some reason, people in laboratories were thinking the same thing. So, today you can buy colours in a tube that glow in the dark. But you can also not have to use colours in tubes and use TV screens as a painter or any other piece of technology that is the carrier of colour and light. So there can be a kind of a real confusion walking into a space and there's nothing that looks like a painting. The work that an artist is doing there is obviously an installation or a video work, but really if you have a close look at the work and look at their story, you can say, no, this is the work of a painter, and maybe this is a piece of expanded painting happening.
Colour figures really, there's a whole chapter on colour in your book.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that at the conclusion of your extensive and I think quite sophisticated engagement with Heidegger to produce an ontology of painting, that what you arrive at as, I wouldn't say in essence, but as the kind of defining feature of painting is colour. So then you proceed to form this ontology of colour as well. Is that, do you think, is that the argument, that beyond questions of frame, beyond questions of materiality that are associated with painting, that it's colour that might define it?
Yeah, look, there was a real kind of moment of truth for me there, which was, at a certain point I could just say, anything and everything is colour, is painting. As anybody could say, anything and everything is sculpture. There was a very current argument that there's no need to even define artists as painters or sculptors or installation artists. We are all artists, and we have all these modes and materials at our fingertips and at our access, and we can use them in any way we want to make any kind of work we want. So I could have gone with that, but it felt like by doing that, was throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And so it was like almost drawing a line in the sand and looking back to the ancients when there was only painting, sculpture and architecture. And each of them had their own very simple specific domain. And the domain of painting was colour. And there felt to me to be a real truth in that. And it also enabled me to link back to that idea that this incredibly technological and diverse world is filled with colour because of technology, and that by claiming colour for painting again, I could claim all those things that generate colour as the palette of the painter.
So it's interesting, and I guess this leads to your development of this idea of post-aesthetics, that the hierarchy of artistic forms, painting, sculpture, and even perfumery and cuisine, often cohered to a hierarchy of senses, the traditional senses. So that painting was for vision, and that sculpture was for touch, or what Norsi calls the touch from a distance, the sense of volume and weight, texture. That cooking is for food, and perfumery is for the nose, etc., etc. That we've tended to think in a much to try and break down a lot of those divisions, and so it's interesting that you're using the strategy of looking at this whole hierarchy as a way of kind of claiming these colourful forms for painting.
Yes, but in terms of the expansion of painting as well, it could also use smell and touch, I think, because touch does generate colour if you apply pressure to your eye. And there's always kind of a point at which the senses overlap with each other, and one sense produces an experience of colour or smell accidentally or by the law of physics, I'm not sure. But the thing I was trying to get to most in post-aesthetics was the idea that there's something wrong. We've gotten rid of connoisseurship and even the word aesthetics some time ago. They're kind of like almost dead words. But there was still something around beauty that was lingering, where it was still dead hand of the past hanging around in some way. So I tried to use some of Heidegger's ideas around using totally different terms, like earth and world.
Yes.
And what do these totally simple words, what could they possibly mean? But they turned out to be really profound terms, and they enabled some kind of discussion about art, where one of the most important parts of art was the invisible, the inarticulable, the mystery, the mysterious. Whereas we're always trying to claim, that we can look at an artwork and work everything out about it, what it's saying, whether it's beautiful or not, whether it's worth buying and so on. But the way Heidegger articulated these terms, there was always the earth, which for him was the thing that enabled things to appear in the world, but only on the deal that it would decay and die and be surrounded by the mysterious and the unknowable. And I just love that idea. So this was a way of, projecting his idea through the idea of painting and expanding painting.
So this is, I guess, the ecological sensibility in Heidegger that I think you touch on in the book. And that relationship to the metaphor of the death of painting is that painting, as it was once known, could become part of the earth and enter back into the world in terms of various other systems. And I think this idea of ecology extends to this provocative idea that you propose at the end of the book, and that of politetics, which is something different from politics, or something that is a kind of an expanded politics, which, unlike politics, which which I guess you propose is a way of changing opinions within a given framework. The politetics is a way of changing the complete structure of ideas. That's very ambitious mission, I guess, that is proposed for art in some ways at the end of your book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the distinction between those two things?
It's really hard because I think you're very accurate. I go close to overextending terms there, and I feel myself becoming stupid as a painter in this particular moment. But it's something like I'm trying to reach for is the idea that there's a politic in every aesthetics, and it's a bit like the Ai Weiwei works in the Sydney Biennale. The political voice is so strong in terms of that large work of Cockatoo Island of the refugees and the giant dinghy, that it's really hard to maintain balance between the two. But there is a way of getting there. But at a certain point, the message of the politics can overwrite and overweigh the mystery of the artistic moment and event. And, I try to talk about the way a politician is only ever working at the level of the message, and therefore nothing can ever be changed, because the only way to bring change is to change the ground of being. And I guess it's kind of, almost an arrogant suggestion that actually artists are closer to being able to change the ground of being than a politician or a successful businessman is. It's almost like saying completely powerless in certain situations are the most powerful, and apophthetics is charting that kind of space between a political statement and an aesthetic position, using some of the ideas pointed backwards in the rest of the book. But yes, it's really I'm really pushing my luck there.
I mean, Ai Weiwei is a kind of interesting example. An artist who's turned towards the political has both kind of catapulted him to worldwide renown, and equally been sort of criticised as using issues to advance his own agendas. That work in particular is interesting because it's one of the few works on the Biennale of Sydney that's actually attempting to do, to be a showstopper, to be so big that it can't be grasped by immediate experience, and then the automatic reaction is to photograph the thing in order to understand it and then share it on social media. Now there's an argument for the work then kind of the issue that's at the core of that work then being shared and propagated out of the world. But there's also an argument of a kind of an overt return towards the picturesque, let's call it, which seems to have infiltrated a lot of art making. I've worked very closely and also quite recently with Yayoi Kusama. I've worked with her over the years. I've seen her work go from being an oddity through to something that's endlessly reproduced. In a way, it sort of anticipated this kind of picturesque moment and this desire to share images. An artist like Katerina Grosser would be somebody who's discussed in depth in your book, would be another one who is circulating kind of quite widely, beyond the installation itself. Partly, I think, as people try to come to terms with the totality of that space, and I'd be interested to know where you think expanded painting sits when the space of its encounter is often no longer immediate. We often encounter a work long before we've even seen it through this crazy circulation of images.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be part and parcel of the process of the dissemblance, dissimulation, deconstruction of painting that turns it into something that can go anywhere in any way. I mean, are you saying that Ai Weiwei has some relationship to painting and expanded painting because of that?
I mean, from a disciplinary perspective, work comes from a sculptural background, interestingly.
Yeah.
But I do think in that it's not a particularly textured sculpture that he's pursuing at the moment, or really in the last kind of 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
And it's one that tends towards the pictorial in its presentation.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there is some kind of rhetorical relationship to painting there.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I think.
Well, maybe then in the instance of Katerina there.
Yeah.
In the kind of proliferation of those images in cyberspace.
Yes. Yeah, definitely, because it's almost like the images return them back to being paintings again, because they're totally environmental experiences. And I think I experienced my first run of Carriage Works in January. And I've seen them all previously in reproduction, but I had the strong feeling that I had seen them live somewhere or other, but I don't think I had. So looking at things in reproduction can be like a dream where you think, maybe I did do that, or was it a dream? I'm not sure we're answering your question. What is it again? What was it again?
I was interested in that relationship of painting to its reproduction, but and it's in the kind of current phase of dissemination of images.
Yeah, and that was something Leon Stillers wrote about in the 80s as well, the Museum Without Walls, and that most Australians only experienced important international art through reproductions in magazines.
I think Ian Byrne made this point too in Reappropriation of Influence. And that the finish fetish meant, and the glossiness of the magazines that were available in Australia in the 1960s.
And the dot screen.
Meant,
very close to it.
Meant that the Australian works produced in a response to that were glossy.
Yeah.